Welcome to the Papyrus Global TV International Desk. From the streets of Kyiv to the flood-ravaged hills of southeastern Brazil, the past week has brought a convergence of crisis and diplomatic maneuvers that underscore the interconnectedness of today's global landscape. As wars persist, nations recalibrate alliances, and natural disasters displace tens of thousands, world leaders and citizens alike are grappling with challenges that test resilience, security, and governance. In Ukraine, the fourth anniversary of Russia's invasion reignited appeals for European integration and Western support, while Iran signaled a potential thaw in nuclear diplomacy with the United States, raising hopes and skepticism among international observers. Meanwhile, escalating violence in Gaza and the West Bank has sparked worldwide protest, highlighting the enduring fragility of Middle Eastern peace. Natural calamities and political shifts add further layers of complexity. Unprecedented floods in Brazil have displaced thousands. The United Kingdom has unveiled a sweeping migration crackdown, and financial investigations suggest that sanctioned Russian trade may be circumventing international controls through the UK-linked territories. Across continents, governments, communities, and humanitarian organizations are confronting crises that test both human endurance and political resolve. This week's headline reveals a world where diplomacy, disaster, and domestic policy collide, shaping not just immediate events but the course of global stability in 2026 and beyond. Welcome to the Papyrus Global TV World News Highlights. I am Christiana Babayo. Here are the headlines. Ukraine at war. 4 years on, Zelensky calls for EU membership amid ongoing strikes. Deadly floods ravage southeastern Brazil. Thousands displaced, rescue efforts underway. Middle East on edge, Gaza violence sparks global protest and diplomatic alarm. UK cracks down on migration as Russian sanctions loophole raise alarms. Ukraine has marked the fourth anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion with solemn commemorations, renewed diplomatic outreach, and a firm call for accelerated European Union membership. The invasion began on February 24, 2022, when Russian forces crossed into Ukrainian territory on multiple fronts, the largest military assault in Europe since World War II. 4 years later, fighting continues across eastern and southern Ukraine, with no comprehensive ceasefire in place. In a nationally televised address from Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky described the war as a defining test of Ukraine's sovereignty and European unity. 4 years ago, our lives changed forever, but we did not surrender and we will not surrender. Ukraine's future is in Europe, he said. Ukraine was granted EU candidate status in June 2022, and Zelensky is now pushing for full membership by 2027. The process requires reforms in anti-corruption measures, judicial independence, and governance standards. Fighting remains intense in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, particularly around Bakhmut and Avdiivka, while southern areas near Zaporizhzhia and Kherson continue to experience artillery exchanges and drone strike. International leaders have reiterated their support. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reaffirmed the bloc's commitment to Ukraine's accession path, while NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg emphasized continued military assistance. Since 2022, Western governments, including the United States under President Donald Trump, have provided tens of billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid. However, debates of long-term funding commitments continue in Washington. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin maintains that Russia's actions are aimed at countering NATO expansion, a claim rejected by Kyiv and its Western allies. Across Ukraine, commemorations were held in Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, and Kharkiv. Candle nights, vigils at Maidan Nezalezhnosy honored fallen soldiers and civilians, underscoring both remembrance and resilience as the war enters its fifth year. Iran has formally signaled openness to renewed nuclear negotiations with the United States, raising cautious optimism among diplomats. President Masoud Pezeshkian stated in Tehran that Iran remains ready for talks based on mutual respect and credible guarantees. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed that indirect contacts with Washington have intensified. The renewed diplomacy comes more than a decade after the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2018 under President Trump. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi recently visited Tehran, emphasizing the importance of transparency and verification. However, trust remains fragile with enrichment levels, sanctions relief, and compliance guarantees still major sticking points. Home Secretary James Cleverly told Parliament that irregular entrants will not be allowed to remain. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak reiterated border control as a top priority. The policy includes expanded detention capacity, accelerated asylum processing, and continued implementation of the Rwanda relocation scheme. Opposition leader Keir Starmer criticized the approach as ineffective, calling instead for stronger EU cooperation. Australian authorities are investigating a Mandarin language bomb threat sent to the lodge, the official residence of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The threat referenced Shen Yun Performing Arts, a cultural group linked to Falun Gong. A search by the Australian Federal Police found no explosives and operations in Canberra have resumed. Investigators are tracing the origin of the message. South Africa's 2026 national budget has drawn sharp criticism after Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana presented fiscal consolidation measures in Parliament. Opposition leaders John Steenhuisen and Julius Malema criticized the budget for failing to address unemployment and inequality. The government says stabilizing public debt and reforming Eskom remains central priorities. Despite the anniversary commemorations, the battlefield reality remains volatile. Fighting continues across eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, areas Russia declared annexed in 2022 but does not fully control. In Donetsk, heavy artillery exchanges have intensified around Avdiivka and Bakhmut, where Ukrainian forces are attempting to stabilize defensive lines following months of attrition warfare. Military analysts describe the situation as a grinding stalemate, with incremental territorial shifts rather than sweeping offenses. In southern Ukraine, particularly near Zaporizhia and Kherson, drone warfare has dramatically increased. Both Ukrainian and Russian forces are deploying long-range unmanned aerial systems, targeting ammunition depots, logistic hubs, and energy infrastructure. Ukrainian military officials say Russia has stepped up glide bomb attacks, powerful aerial ammunitions launched from fighter jets operating just outside Ukrainian air defense range. Meanwhile, Kyiv continues to appeal for advanced air defense systems, arguing that protecting cities and energy facilities remain critical as winter conditions strain infrastructure. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that battlefield resilience is directly tied to sustained Western military support. Since 2022, Ukraine has received tens of billions of dollars in military, financial, and humanitarian aid from Western allies. The United States remains the largest contributor, followed by the European Union and individual NATO member states. Under President Donald Trump, Washington has continued assistance but with increased scrutiny over long-term funding commitments. Debate within the U.S. Congress reflects broader public fatigue in some quarters, with lawmakers questioning whether additional aid packages should include stricter oversight mechanisms. European leaders, however, have signaled more unified messaging. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reiterated that Ukraine's security is inseparable from Europe's security, pledging continued financial backing and reconstruction planning. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg emphasized that sustained arms deliveries, particularly artillery, ammunition, and air defense systems, remain essential to prevent Russian territorial advances. However, analysts warn that Western stockpiles are under strain, raising questions about long-term sustainability should the war extend several more years. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin continues to frame the conflict as a defensive operation against NATO expansion and Western encirclement. The Kremlin argues that Ukraine's potential NATO membership represents a security threat to Russia's borders, a claim rejected by Kyiv and Western governments, who describe the invasion as a violation of international law and Ukrainian sovereignty. Russian state media has increasingly emphasized themes of national resilience and economic adaptation under sanctions. Despite sweeping Western sanctions targeting banking, energy exports, and technology imports, Russia's economy has shown signs of adjustment, largely through energy trade diversification towards Asia. Military analysts note that Russia has also expanded domestic arms production and strengthened defense cooperation with partners such as Iran and North Korea. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels remain largely frozen. Formal peace negotiations have not resumed since early 2022, and both sides publicly insist that any settlement must reflect their territorial and security demands position that currently appear far apart. Iran has signaled a willingness to re-engage in nuclear negotiations with the United States, raising cautious optimism after years of stalled diplomacy. President Masoud Pezeshkian emphasized that Tehran seeks talks conducted on the basis of mutual respect and credible guarantees, asserting that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful and in compliance with international law. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi noted that indirect communication channels with Washington have intensified, underscoring that constructive discussions are possible if the U.S. demonstrates seriousness in lifting sanctions. The negotiations hark back to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA), which curtailed Iran's nuclear activity in exchange for sanctions relief. The Trump administration's 2018 withdrawal disrupted the agreement, triggering a cycle of sanctions, retaliatory measures, and rising regional tensions. Key sticking points remain uranium enrichment levels, scope of sanctions relief, verification mechanisms, and assurances against unilateral future withdrawals by the US or its allies. Global reactions are mixed. In Jerusalem, Benjamin Netanyahu has warned against any agreement that leaves Iran capable of high-level enrichment. Riyadh and Ankara have called for diplomatic restraint to prevent escalation in the Middle East. Energy markets are also watching closely as potential sanctions relief could affect oil exports and global supply chains. Analysts suggest that trust, long eroded over the past decade, remains the core deficit in US-Iran relations. Preliminary talks may be held in Switzerland or neighboring states in March 2026. Oman and Qatar again potentially serving as intermediaries. While a formal agreement is uncertain, the revival of dialogue marks a notable shift and could determine regional security dynamics and energy market stability in the coming months. Emergency teams, including military units and fire services, are working to promote debris, rescue stranded residents, and prevent disease outbreaks. Federal funds have been mobilized for food, medical aid, and temporary housing, while hospitals brace for potential waterborne illnesses. Climate experts note that southeastern Brazil is increasingly vulnerable to extreme rainfall due to warming ocean temperatures and urban expansion. Petropolis, still recovering from the 2022 floods, faces compounded risk due to informal hillside settlements. Analysts warn that repeated climate shocks threaten regional stability, economic productivity, and long-term urban planning. Violence between Israel and Palestinian groups has intensified in Gaza and the West Bank. Israeli airstrikes on February 23rd to February 24th targeted Hamas' position following rocket fire into southern Israel. Casualties include dozens of civilians in Gaza, though independent verifications remain limited. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed ongoing operations, emphasizing citizen protection. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas condemned attacks and called for international intervention. Hamas leaders reiterated resistance, heightening fears for prolonged conflict. Global reactions including emergency UN Security Council meetings, US diplomatic engagement and mediation efforts by Egypt and Qatar. International protests erupted in London, Paris, New York and Istanbul, reflecting worldwide concern over civilian casualties and broader regional stability. Opposition parties, civil society groups and human rights advocates have criticized the plan for potential humanitarian violations, particularly for vulnerable asylum seekers. Labour leader Keir Starmer called for diplomatic engagement with the EU to address root causes of migration rather than punitive measures. Analysts suggest migration remains politically sensitive, impacting public sentiment, employment debates and regional diplomacy. The crackdown coincides with ongoing scrutiny over UK-Rwanda asylum agreements and reflects broader post-Brexit migration policy trends. Investigative findings indicate that Russian-linked companies routed $8 billion in trade through UK overseas territories post-2022 sanctions. Assets included luxury yachts, private aircraft and energy-related equipment, raising questions about enforcement efficacy. The report highlights structural weaknesses in tracking sanctioned transactions through offshore jurisdictions such as the British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands. While offshore entities are legal, layered corporate ownership complicates oversight and sanction enforcement. And that's all we have on the Papyrus Global TV World News Highlights. I am Christiana Babayo. Thanks for joining us and stay tuned to the Papyrus Global TV.